Today we're here to talk about sustainable seafood.
Sustainability is a concept by which the needs of the present are met without compromising the ability for future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainable seafood does just that. Sustainable seafood represents a healthy relationships with our oceans that can last forever. Sustainable seafood is a way to replenish our oceans and manage their resources into the future. In order to be sustainable, one needs to be both environmentally and economically sustainable. Not so long ago, the ocean's bounties seems to have no limit. Now we know better. Efficient fishing fleets and ever-growing hunger for seafood have pushed many of the world's fisheries to the brink. We acknowledge that all seafood is not sustainable, but much of it is. Not only is sustainable seafood the way of the future, but sustainable fisheries exist already today. We have fisheries that are environmentally sustainable, as they don't catch more fish than the amount that gives the future generations the same access to fish that we have today. Like a learning class, if you take out seafood at a sustainable level, fish populations will remain viable into the future. If you take out seafood at the level below the maximum sustainable yield, fish population will actually increase into the future. We have fisheries that are economically sustainable, which provide increased profits for future generations. To this end, there are currently several reputable authorization regimes. These are systems that guarantee the sustainability of seafood. We acknowledge that there is a growing problem with mislabeling and that this will confuse consumers. Still, there are some reputable authorities who base their labeling on high standards and strict criteria, such as the Marine Stewardship Council and the Seafood Watch. The MSC and the Seafood Watch makes recommendations for what seafood to eat based on factors like fishery habitat, species, and overall management. This helps consumers and businesses make good choices concerning what seafood to eat.
Even though we recognize that the current system of labeling is flawed, consumers have still pushed the market towards sustainable seafood. As we move toward a more proper labeling system, consumers will be able to make choices for their seafood needs based on the values that they hold, including environmental and sustainable and social values, and therefore push the demand even further and therefore the supply even further of sustainable seafood. Retailers have taken notice of the demand for sustainable seafood as well. McDonald's in Europe only uses MSC certified sustainable fish for all of its products. Whole Foods Market will not sell any items on Seafood Watch's red list. Walmart and Safeway also will only sell MSC certified seafood. Of course, sustainable seafood is not just for the developed world, it's also for the developing world. For example, Papua New Guinea has laws that it enforces regarding its fisheries and its aquaculture systems that must be sustainable. Quota systems are an effective regulatory mechanism to use in order to maintain sustainability. Individual transferable quotas, or ITQ systems, set total allowable catches, which then ensure that fishermen only take out a given number of fish up to a level and not over that level. This prevents the tragedy of the open access, as previously occurred, because there weren't laws governing this resource. Salmon fisheries in Alaska and Maine lobster fisheries off the coast of Maine have used this very effectively. When government and scientists and fishermen come together as invested parties and all come to a consensus, this leads to successful sustainable fisheries. Overall, sustainability is a path, not a destination. As such, with the definition of sustainability, the criteria certification systems, and the successful stories of sustainable fisheries, we are confident in concluding that sustainable seafood is in fact truly sustainable. After all, as the old saying goes, give a man a fish and he eats for a day. Teach a man to fish and he eats for a lifetime. But teach a man to fish sustainably, and he and his descendants will be able to eat for many lifetimes. Thank you.
Guys, to cover unsustainable economic, environmental, and policy practices. Sustainable seafood actually accelerates the decline of the fisheries and gives the false impression to the consumer that all is well with the oceans, when in fact the oceans are in crises. Globally, 75% of all major fisheries are either fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted. The only way to save the oceans and create sustainable seafood is to lower demand and not increase the demand for so-called sustainable seafood. The systematic and extensive removal of large predatory fish from the top of the food chain has changed the structure of many marine communities and the way ecosystems function. Changes in the marine environment may well affect the resilience and ability to adapt to the likely effects of climate change. Again, the assumption that seafood can be sustainable distracts from the real problem. Overcapacity in fisheries is due to government subsidies. This overcapitalization of the industry accelerates the race to the bottom of the food chain. The size of the individual fish within the catches is getting smaller, and many essential species are in decline. Trawling and bycatch are removing essential tertiary species as harvesting moves further down the food chain. This graph represents 3 fisheries in India and illustrates the problem with the commercialization of bycatch. It used to be that bycatch was discarded back into the ocean. Now these fish are being used in aquaculture and poultry feed. Without this income from bycatch, the fishery would no longer be economically viable. The blue curve reflects the target species, which are past the point of collapse, that are maintained by bycatch, as illustrated by the red line. Bycatch prolongs the economic stability of the fisheries, but decimates the environmental sustainability. Although many look to aquaculture to avoid depleting wild fish, it actually makes the problem worse. First of all, it is inefficient. It takes 5 kilos of anchovies to make 1 kilo of salmon. Although some aquaculture has more sustainable practices, their systems require unique ecological situations, and their existence raises the demand for sustainable fisheries, which is met by unsustainable aquaculture, which destroys wetlands and wild populations. The ocean is a finite resource and is a complex, interconnected ecosystem that has been overfished for decades and is at peril. At the current trajectory, world fisheries will collapse completely by the year 2048.
Next is about the policy failures. There are 3 types of policy failures for sustainable fisheries: mislabeling, TSE and ITQ and TSE systems, and certification. As we learned in the class, mislabeling has been globally reported at an enormous level. The loophole in laws and Pentagon for this practice. For example, the U.S. law allows generic names on fish like frozen fillet. And another reason is insufficient monitoring. According to the FDA, only 0.59% of import fish were inspected in 2006 in the United States. As a result, the current fish market is full of mislabeling. And the second policy failure is ITQ and TSE system. Although we have seen several successful cases with this kind of system, they still have shortcomings, especially about cheating of fishing boat on the sea. It's reported that illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing is worth $25 billion per year. So how can we believe that fish caught under TSC and ITQ system meet a sustainable standard?
First, it's worthwhile to consider the terms of this debate. Is sustainable seafood truly sustainable? What we are arguing is simple, that yes, sustainable seafood does exist and there are certification systems and authorization systems in place currently to ensure its sustainability, such as the Marine Stewardship Council, such as Seafood Watch. Finally, we are arguing that this seafood is economically sustainable as well, as is evident by the ever-growing demand for these seafood products. The mislabeling of seafood was brought up. Yes, it does happen. Yes, this is a problem. However, this is a separate issue tangential to the terms of our current debate. Of course, accurate labeling helps support the market that supports sustainable seafood. However, the issue at hand is a supply issue of whether that fish that you are buying, regardless of its label, was sustainably caught or not. So that begs the question, what does it mean to be caught sustainably? I will refer to Seafood Watch as a good standard for that. However, first, it's worth noting that there is no single gold standard for a sustainable fishery. Not all capture fisheries are unsustainable, and not all aquaculture is better than capture fisheries. Fisheries are the unit of analysis here, not species. They're examined on a case-by-case basis, and they must use adaptive management. And that is the whole point of these certification schemes, in order to tell you as a consumer on a case-by-case basis whether a fishery is sustainable or not. Seafood Watch uses 4 criteria. It is peer-reviewed, it uses the best available science, and is updated at least every 5 years. These criteria is 1, it looks at the stock status currently, which includes inherent resilience, fecundity, biomass estimates, fishing mortality. Criteria 2 is bycatch, it examines all species caught with the target species and adjusts the ranking of the target species for the lowest ranked bycatch. Criteria 3, management effectiveness of the fishery. Does it respond to appropriate science? Criteria 4, impacts on habitat and ecosystem considerations. These criteria ensure that the seafood ranked as sustainable is indeed sustainable, and I open the opposition to find any flaw with these criteria. Fish meal is also brought up. This is a concern of aquaculture. It is not the only concern, and it is not even the most important concern. There is eutrophication, acidification, climate change, overall energy consumption, and on. For each of these concerns, there's a spectrum of less to greater environmental impact, and there are best practices for each. In terms of biotic depletion, best practices entail harvesting lower on the trophic level, using closed holistic systems such as Dan Barber's Vida La Palma, etc. Innovations continue. The history of human ingenuity only suggests that these innovations will increase in the future in ways we cannot currently imagine. Yes, the oceans have depleted, and we once considered them inexhaustible. We have ravaged the ocean stocks. However, we are living within a new paradigm currently. We as humans do learn from our mistakes, even if it takes the near annihilation of our oceans to do so. The errors of the past are not permanent, and we have the choice to eat sustainable seafood. The market demand is there. The will to change is there. I've talked about general issues. Cynthia now will give us a concrete case study of this in place.
So our case study will be Iceland. In 1966, they had fished out their fishery and it was collapsed. Since then, in 1974, because of UNCLOS, which is United Nations Conservation Law of the Sea, they gave countries the power to manage their own EEZs, 200 nautical miles off their coast. This gave the power to Iceland to control their own oceans. Right after that, they implemented ITQs, which is individual trade quotas, their marketing system to manage the fisheries. Because of that, they successfully harvested herring again in 1979. After that, they tried the system with capelin, demerals, and then also cod. Because of the success, since 2001, they've had a 5% profit every single year. Even during the 2009 economic recession, while 97% of their national stock went bankrupt and 780 companies also went bankrupt, the fishing industry was relatively intact. Their power in this industry is so strong that they won't even join the European Union right now. As of right now, the reason they don't want to join the European Union is because they're so strong. So to conclude, sustainable fisheries are sustainable.
reinforce to answer some of the points that were made by our colleagues, and we want to reinforce the concept that sustainable seafood is truly not sustainable. So why are fisheries declines allowed to occur? Our colleagues told us that sustainable fisheries is a way to replenish our oceans, yet we see continued collapse in fisheries. Overfishing occurs because all the economic incentives are in place for it to occur. The economic drivers being subsidies, particularly to the traditional fishing industries, the barrier of entry, huge barrier of entry to get certified by MSC, by the smaller fishers that tend to fish more effectively, various tax systems. The fact that we're looking at $138 billion worth of fish sold last year. And we want to look at how much of that was caught and certified in a sustainable way. So let's look at IUU fishing. Kay already told you there's $25 billion worth of business in IUU fishing. And I wanted to respond to our colleagues' claim that in Papua New Guinea, they force seafood to be caught sustainably. I may have misquoted this, but basically they have a system in place now, and they're basically, saying everything has to be caught sustainably. That's interesting because in developing nations, we know that they tend to be under-resourced. They don't have the resources to enforce laws. They may have good laws on the books. Having good laws on the books is a great first step. Let's look at this quickly. This shows you the developing fish that is certified by MSC that is caught in developing countries in the light blue, and the developed countries that are caught in the developed countries in the darker blue on the bottom. There's a total. I want to talk about IUU fishing. IUU fishing, basically they invade developing countries. They invade their waters in New Guinea in particular, also Africa, and they're not allowed, and pirate fishermen come in and just rape their seas, and they are not regulated. Shifting baselines, this is a good one. We were also told here that salmon fisheries in Alaska have used these systems successfully. I quote, "Good management, healthy habitat." But so what is sustainable fish? It's caught in order to be certified as sustainable. It's not that the needs of the present now meet the needs of the future. It is what is the status of the stock, the fish stock, and how is it caught? What were the methods that were caught? That's how it's certified. In the salmon fisheries, they are caught. They are actually listed as on one of the two seafood guides as a good choice. They're caught with gill nets, and they use trolling gear. And meanwhile, 3 sockeye subspecies have recently been labeled as endangered. So is that a healthy stock? Is that a sustainable way to catch the fish? This is looking quickly. This is shifting baselines. This is the abalone fishery in Santa Barbara in 1920. A slow-growing mollusk like this is basically effectively mining. They have been declared commercially not viable and illegal as of 1997. Neither Seafood Watch nor Blue Ocean Institute's system mentions anything about abalone and whether you should eat it. So let's look at their guides. Here's Seafood Watch, very well researched, high caliber, excellent institution, known more in North America, outside North America, the Blue Ocean Institute's ocean-friendly seafood. I went through these, and there is basically a 30% mismatch between the two certification levels of what kind of fish are the best kind of fish. So let's look really quickly. This is the next slide, shows the Blue Ocean Institute. This is one of their partners. It says on their site, these guys fish sustainably, eat their food. Look, they have Atlantic salmon listed on their menu. They have shrimp tray, and we know that shrimp bycatch is like 95% catch of shrimp is 95% bycatch. We've already talked about salmon. Red snapper is listed as red by both certification agencies. So quickly, I want to finish with Seafood Watch. They do monitor every 5 years, but they list pollock as a good alternative. Pollock, the stocks of pollock and the pollock population in the East Bering Sea have decreased by 67% in the last 2 years, not 5 years. and they tell you it's a good alternative because it's labeled by MSC. But MSC label allows fisheries that use trawlers to be certified as sustainable.
Good call. Oysters do not require any fish meal to grow because they're filter feeders. The oyster fishery in New Jersey has been labeled as sustainable. On what grounds would this not be considered sustainable?
By an ever-growing demand for so-called sustainable oysters. As their PR spreads, so will the demand for sustainable oysters. Oh, sorry. Okay. Also, filter feeders are the most prone to disaster, and therefore, at any moment, an oil spill could take out this, or oil spill or any kind of disaster could take out this population and cause widespread disease. Also, this small fishery is not going to be able to meet the demand, and therefore, the demand will be met by unsustainable oyster alternatives.
Contributes to pollution of the ocean by the waste matter, the antibiotics that are used, and the various sort of non-natural components of the aquaculture system. So one particular incident is not going to kind of save the world as far as the oyster population goes.
Policy have shown some success in limiting catch, but they usually leave only the largest boats functioning in the fishery, leading to loss of jobs of generational small and medium-sized fishermen. How can you account for the loss of economic diversity and the greater risk to the ecosystem by use of larger fishing piers and larger quantities of fuel?
Economic or social diversity, we're not trying to include everyone in the game. If you can innovate, if you have the ability to have the technology that is the most effective, then you stay in place. If not, then you go out of business. This is how businesses work, and we are not trying to encourage small boats just because they're small.
So we would like to talk also about MPAs in Alaska. Alaska has 40 MPAs, and we've seen that marine protected areas are very successful in protecting ecosystem and systems and biodiversity in areas. Alaska is highly regarded in the sustainable seafood world, and it's proven because they have about, I think, 1.5 million nautical miles of marine protected area seas.
So these protected areas add to the sustainability of their ITQ system, which only takes out a number of fish that allows the environmental ecosystems to rebound. Now, additionally, when these MPAs are located next to them, which they are, trust me, the map's all over everything, then the fish stocks are able to rebound before they're caught again. Now, Alaska has been ranked one of the most diverse locations in the entire United States. It continues to be so, and its fish stocks continue to gain importance every year. Thank you.
If the Vita La Palma fishery discussed in the Dan Barber TEDx speech we watched in class can be successfully ecologically and economically sustainable without any subsidies, how is this not sustainable?
We've had a lot of discussion about that fishery, and our feeling is, it's a wonderful example of what could be done, but it's a drop in the bucket, and it needs a very unique system, which is basically very rare and non-existent. And our argument is that you might have a few isolated examples of sustainable fisheries, quote, but the whole ocean is basically a network. It's not a closed system. And to assume that because you have one small aspect of it functioning theoretically in the short term does not mean in the long term it will remain so. The ocean is in peril and on the verge of ecosystem collapse.
And I have a comment. More than half of the seafood that is produced there is exported and flown, and I don't see how it's sustainable to fly seafood for the fuel and fly seafood around the world. How can you call that sustainable?
And then just one more point on that. I know personally, before I was educated, that I thought because there were quote these sustainable labels that in fact, and I think it actually drives the consumption of fish upward, which is a big problem.
People will see that TED Talk and think that aquaculture is a sustainable option, and so then when they see farm fish as a label, they'll associate it with these sustainable practices when really it is more likely to be associated with depletion of wetlands and decimation of wild populations.
So with illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing valued at $25 billion per year, and most of them is mislabeled sustainable. Now, how can you ensure that the poaching is not taking place in so-called sustainable fisheries and therefore skewing that catch size data?
That fishing around the world is in a really bad state. You know, mislabeling, IUU fishing, overfishing. By no means did any of us ever sit down in this little row here and think that we would ever convince anyone that the state of the oceans is good right now. That was never the case. However, there are locations, there are places where sustainable fishing is taking place. It is taking place, and we know it's taking place because we're using the best available science, the best available evaluation, and the best available monitoring in order to determine that it is sustainable. IUU fishing is a huge problem. However, in places like Alaska, Iceland, help me out guys, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, they do very good large-scale regulation of their fisheries and can determine when IUU fishing occurs. It's not universal. We are saying that there are sustainable fisheries, they do exist, and that they are identified by certain authorization agencies. Furthermore, when we're talking about sustainable fishing, we're not just talking about wild-caught fisheries. We're also talking about aquaculture. Now, aquaculture is, I'm going to go ahead and say, in a transitional period. There are definitely best practices, and there's definitely not a lot of good practices. However, there is a way forward. And it is not possible to decrease the demand of fish. I'm going to go ahead and say that it hypothetically in a science fiction novel maybe, but not today. So we've got to figure out a way around this. One example is agri-marine.
Let me tell you all about agri-marine. It is very exciting. Closed, it's called a recirculation aquaculture system. And it is this system, usually they have closed systems above lands in a tank where they do aquaculture. And it's closed, so they don't pollute into the natural ecosystem around it. This one's underwater, and it was made in Canada. It was piloted in China, and they just did it in America. And this year in March, they sold their first batch of salmon, Chinook salmon, to Safeway. Safeway is rated as the #1 most sustainable seafood according to Greenpeace's criteria, which we're really not going to talk about too much, but it is a really, really stringent, strict criteria. And Safeway has been on their criteria for 2 years in a row, and it's I think the very first one in 6 years to ever get a green rating. So agri-marine is selling to them, and it's because they use very little fuel, they use very good food-fish ratio, and just a great system that is happening now.
Our colleagues mentioned something about large sizes versus small sizes of animals and how only small-sized organisms are being caught. An example of a successful sustainable fishery is the Maine lobster fishery, which saw in 2011 lobstermen bringing in over 100 million pounds of lobster because they were larger size lobster, because they were allowed to grow to a certain size due to regulations, because lobstermen off the coast of Maine are not allowed to bring in smaller lobster, at a value of over $330 million. This is the highest lobster collection ever in recorded history, and how would this not be sustainable? Economically.
I think that you misunderstood. We didn't say that they were just fishing the smaller species out. I think what we're trying to say is that the industry has been subsidized by governments and bycatch, and only for those reasons does it remain economically sustainable.
And also with taking out the larger species, eventually that's what's been happening for all these years, is they were always taking out the larger species and the smaller species were left. And so that's what has been fished in major populations now.
And the crash of the Maine lobster industry in the first place was brought about by starting off with the large lobster species as we know. So if they're allowing them to grow currently sustainable, still picking up the small ones and throwing them back out. We're looking at shifting baselines once again. Paul, a world famous marine biologist, Daniel Pauly, coined the term shifting baselines in the 90s for the fishing industry's sort of ability to forget or erase the past. And so you're looking at a recovered lobster industry today relative to a completely depleted lobster industry in the recent past. So is it going to be, I'll put the question to you, is it going to be sustainable to start capturing all the big ones again?
It also requires usually closures and restarting of the economy of the fishery, and so there are major upfront costs to this kind of change. A lot of times they're funded by NGOs. We have some great example of ITQ systems and et cetera funded off of California, but it's just not practical on a global scale, which is required to have sustainability long term.
So within the market for seafood products, the supermarkets represent 50 to 85% of seafood sales. Yet there is no reliable labeling and trade tracking system for the small percentage of seafood that is called sustainably. How can the consumer know that the seafood that they are buying is sustainable?
Seafood Watch's recommendations. There are over 2,500 recommendations available with Seafood Watch, and not all of them fit on these cards. So they tend to print them regionally. So there is abalone actually on one of these cards. I'll show you later. But along with supply chains, you asked how can they be traceable? Well, with that, there's two good examples. We have Safeway and Walmart. I can tell you about Safeway. Safeway, they've committed to enforcing their whole entire supply chain, and they actually use an organization called Fishwise that is a third-party member to help them make sure that all the way from the fishermen to their market, it is traceable, and they follow corporate social responsibility, good ethics. So they verify that the whole entire line is sustainable and follow their regulations. Whole Foods is another one, and they use MSC certification, and they also have committed to sustainable practices. And recently, I think it was Senator Brown in Massachusetts, he said that because Whole Foods said that they wouldn't sell from the red list anymore, Senator Brown said that it was based off uncertain science and that people were losing jobs in Massachusetts. Just want to point out that Whole Foods, the CEO said that they went to the fishermen and talked with them and found enough fishermen that did want to practice the same sustainable methods to supply all the fish that they need for all their markets around the world. So.
Furthermore, when you're talking about economic sustainability, subsidies, as we have discussed in length in class, don't exactly drive towards productive ways. They promote overexploitation, which is why Marine Stewardship Council does not certify anyone who uses subsidies. So it can be included in the definition of sustainability that a sustainable fishery is not supported by subsidies.
What global data and evidence supports your position?
Global seafood production, sustainable seafood production, I apologize. Currently, 6% of the global market is supplied through MSC certified fisheries. Furthermore, Seafood Watch has over 2,000 species certified on their registry. Now, also, aquaculture currently accounts for approximately 45% of world seafood.
MPAs? Yes, so there were targets set for marine protected areas, MPAs. These targets have not been met globally. Currently there's somewhere around 2% of the world's ocean. However, the effectiveness of those MPAs has been again and again demonstrated through peer-reviewed journals. There is a rule of thumb that demonstrates that preserving 25% of the available fishing area can lead to a 50% enhancement of surrounding fisheries, a net gain overall. As far as ITQ systems go, the value of ITQs has increased greatly since 1984, from about 25 million US dollars to now around $4 billion in 2010. And this just demonstrates how effective these systems are worldwide economically.
And to go along with that, an example of an MPA would be one MPA off the coast of Baja California, which once it instituted an MPA, increased its fish populations and fish stock by 463%, which is, I think, by all accounts, significant. Also, in terms of our 45% of our seafood being in aquaculture, these systems are getting better and better. We are moving towards a more perfect system every day, and this leads to further sustainability.
And one further point, the issue at hand is not how much seafood is sustainable, the issue is whether the seafood that is sustainable is truly sustainable. Our argument is not that it is across the board found everywhere, it's that can you show that the seafood that is sustainably caught is not sustainable? Find a hole in Seafood Watch's criteria.
The reference to the 6% of the worldwide catch that is certified by the Marine Stewardship Council. Yeah, interestingly, in 2006, when the Marine Stewardship Council formed an alliance with Walmart, certifications went up exponentially. So that prior to the alliance with Walmart, there were 23 certified fisheries from the time they were formed in 1997 until 2006. Today there are 200. The holes are just getting bigger. It's getting easier to get certified because of the demand, the market demand from the Walmart.
And they also discussed about how ITQs eliminate small-scale fisheries, which is just, too bad. The Marine Stewardship Council also eliminates small-scale fisheries. There's only one small-scale fishery that's certified under the Marine Stewardship Council, and yet over 12 million people are employed in small-scale fisheries, only about 500,000 in large-scale, and they have the exact same percentage of the global catch. They each bring in about 30 million tons, and there are 4 fish caught per 4 to 8 tons of fish caught for every ton of fuel consumed in small-scale fisheries, whereas there's just 1 ton of fish caught for every ton of fuel consumed in large scale.
Also, the FDA only inspects 0.59% of imported fish. So I think that's a pretty strong indication that we really aren't able to monitor where our fish is from and whether or not it's being tracked properly.
70% has shown to be mislabeled as well, even of MSC fisheries, including sea bass.
Exactly. There was actually a study done, I can't remember what article or what newspaper it was, but it stated that 15% of the Chilean sea bass they had came from outside of the area that they thought, and 8% wasn't sea bass at all.
Significant disagreement amongst certifiers on what constitutes the criteria for sustainability, and therefore there's different species on different lists. Doesn't that undermine your core argument that there is a uniform set of scientific criteria?
The unit of analysis is not species. Salmon caught in the Pacific Ocean versus salmon caught in the Atlantic Ocean are not going to be subject to the same sustainability requirements. The unit of analysis is fisheries, particular gear types and particular locations. That right there is a big discrepancy among different rating systems. Beyond that, these are guidelines, they are best practices, they entail a lot of the same criteria, and there is a lot of overlap if you look at fisheries of the same region and location.
And we would encourage consumers to do their research. There are reputable certification agencies, so obviously informed consumers would need to know which ones do they consider reputable. As we have mentioned, Marine Stewardship Council and Seafood Watch. And just to add, Marine Stewardship Council did see a huge increase in certification agencies after it signed the agreement with Walmart because there was a huge incentive to be more sustainable. Their certification and their evaluations did not change at all. It actually increased the amount of sustainable seafood in the market because it encouraged it through incentive.
And I want to say that Seafood Watch did recognize that there is confusion because there's so much eco-labeling, which is why in 2012, this year, they changed their criteria system a little bit to help consumers better understand it.
There is an overall movement currently to get a one uniform criteria going. It is going to take some funding. However, I would expect to see it coming out in the next couple of years to address this very issue. However, sustainable seafood is sustainable, and it is recognized by several reputable agencies.
And to go with that development of the single system for classifying fish, the Global Aquaculture Performance Index and the Farm Level Aquaculture Performance Index are also being included in those discussions, in that consideration, as well as the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. So overall, we're getting aquaculture and wild-caught fisheries put into these criteria.
Keep in mind that these are peer-reviewed and updated regularly.
Second question for the con side. You made a statement in the beginning that you thought it was the subsidies, for fisheries that were really driving unsustainable practices. So therefore, if certification forbids the subsidies of the industry, would that then meet most of your criteria for what would be truly sustainable?
We are saying subsidies is a big problem because globally, about 60% of the subsidies are capacity enhancing, meaning they push and they pressure like boats to enter situations of overcapacity. But as far as if it would be a remedy or if it would like debunk our argument, no, it wouldn't.
And if anything, it makes it worse because the subsidies for unsustainable fishing aren't going away. And so it just puts more sustainable fisheries at a disadvantage, making them not economically sustainable. Back to the small scale fishing, $5 to $7 billion in subsidies go to small scale fishing, and $25 to $27 billion go to large scale fishing. So there's just no way for them to compete in the market as well.
And these are small-scale fisheries that are certified by MSC. So we are saying that we reject the idea that you have to reject subsidies in order to be certified. That's not
Here, we've been grappling with the mislabeling issue here a lot. Given how endemic it is to the entire, all global fisheries, and that it has yet to be dealt with, doesn't it by definition kind of prove that a lot of poaching is going on that is probably undermining the sustainability, even if the criteria are okay, that there's all this illegality undermining the robustness of the system?
Can I point out then that, again, that Safeway and Walmart monitor their supply chain from the fishermen at the fisheries all the way up to their market. They train their employees to be knowledgeable in their sustainable fish. So examples of this kind of traceability does exist right now, and that's all I'm going to say.
Okay. So the mislabeling issue is a huge concern industry-wide, and it does create a lot of confusion, especially for the consumer who is not educated on the specific fish and the specific industry, the specific certification labels they are looking for. However, it would be a mistake to assume that the entirety of all fisheries are completely unsustainable because of this issue. It would also be a mistake to assume that just because mislabeling is occurring with some fisheries who have at one point considered to be sustainable, that other ones are lying. There are proven, well-documented, high-publicized examples, including Alaska salmon from Bristol Bay and many other places that are considered universally to be well-managed and sustainable.
I want to clarify your position on aquaculture. So this is kind of two-part, which is, first, are you claiming that even herbivorous land-based aquaculture would not meet the criteria of sustainability? And if so, is that because of some particular scientific criteria, or is it just because you don't think that would be sufficient to meet demand?
Is this freshwater? The land-based ones are generally freshwater.
You can take that, as generally as you want.
We're more concerned with saltwater, we agree.
The two teams agreed that seafood means saltwater.
Proceed as you will.
All right.
Change your mind.
But I mean, I think the main problem is,
Okay. So at the moment, we think that there's not enough information to definitively say which aquacultures can truly be considered sustainable, because there's a reason that TED Talk was so, monumentous and important, because that was such an unusual example of successful aquaculture, because most of the time, as we know, mangroves are cut down, farmed shrimp, and there's high eutrophication levels and very nutrient-rich areas and hormone injection into these species. Herbivorous aquaculture is definitely preferable, considering the high amount of crayfish that is needed to raise carnivorous fish. But unless there are very specific circumstances like the one in Veta La Palma, at the moment I don't think that it's necessarily, it can be considered sustainable overall. And there is a major issue of meeting demand, because there's just, I think we're convinced that certification and everything just isn't a reliable way to know whether or not what you're eating is sustainable and where it comes from. So unless you fly to Veta La Palma and fish it out yourself, then I'm just not convinced. So, yeah.
And then there's the added problem of the fact that there may be initial upfront costs that are very expensive. There could be regulatory issues that make it difficult to apply this same program or aquaculture system around the world, especially in developing countries. So we can say in specific places it may work, but on a global scale, that's another question.
And it also only worked because there was already a decimated wetlands there. So it's considered sustainable because they didn't destroy it themselves, but they were still benefiting from it. So.
And finally, we're talking about 60% of the fish market is now farmed. And the technologies, the great technologies like that Cynthia mentioned, are great innovations. We're not saying aquaculture cannot be improved in the future. We're talking about, is sustainable seafood sustainable today? Sustainable seafood that's labeled sustainable from farm fish, is it sustainable now under current labeling, under the current regime?
And given kind of the great variability in the environment, especially with climate change and pollution episodes and dead zones and just updated scientific knowledge, isn't that 5-year lag too great a time to really ensure sustainability when things can be changing on a seasonal or yearly basis?
For these systems to be valid, they have to be based on best available science, peer-reviewed scientific articles. As we know, writing research papers, there's a definite lag behind publication dates. This is just built into the system. That being said, fish stocks, it depends on the fish species, how much it varies year by year. 5 years, honestly, is about as good as you're going to get for a renewal of the systems. And a previous ranking, if the management in place is currently good, there's not going to be a lot of opportunity for it to be so decimated within that short amount of time, outside of a total regime change of the fishery.
Furthermore, we know that certain sustainable seafood fisheries are sustainable because their ability to catch fish gets better with every single year. And as we saw with our lovely graph of a seafood fishery, that can only happen if they're actually doing a better job managing their fishery. So the idea is that sustainable seafood will be available for future generations. If the fish stocks continue to get better, then that's the point.
Fisheries are normally managed, at least wild catch, is you look at biomass estimates, historically, how much biomass is there currently to determine whether the stock is overfished or if it's not overfished. Then you're looking at fishing mortality rates to determine whether overfishing is occurring. And then you also look at the management regime in place.
Go ahead.
And so you look at the management regime in place and whether it is able to adapt to changing scenarios in the environment, in the fishery, or not. And so one estimate there, that gives you, it's just a snapshot in time, but it gives you how it's reacted in the past and how it's able to react in the future as well.
Okay, and I wanted to say, I can't say for MSC, but for Seafood Watch, they don't do it every 5 years, like in intervals. When something does occur, sometimes they'll change it in a year, 2 years, 3 years, depends on what data they have and the circumstance, but they do update their reports at different intervals. So if something happened to a whole entire fish or shrimp population, they would probably research it, but it's not exactly 5 years.
Can you elaborate on the claim that you've made kind of throughout, which is, or that you've intimated, hinted at, that that sustainable seafood certification actually might be making matters worse. So your claim is not only that it's not sustainable, but that it's doing something to actually make the global situation worse. So you can elaborate and provide some evidence for that.
Yeah, certification problem. It's our basically mislabeling issue is, I mean, food across the world is basically being mislabeled. In Ireland, about, I think it was 28% of hack, and in New York, I think the sushi restaurants basically show that mislabeling is happening everywhere. And the problem is it gives the appearance of abundance of sustainable seafood. And if there really was sustainable seafood, that wouldn't be a problem. That means you're fueling some good behavior by the consumer. But the fact that oftentimes food that may have been sustainable from the ship, but by the time it ends up in the processing plant is mixed up with unsustainable fish. So by the time it gets to the customer, it never is. Then it means it's not sustainable anymore. So
It's also distracting from these issues that need to be addressed, because these wonderful fisheries that they're over there talking about aren't getting the credit that they deserve because of these mislabeling issues. It's unclear what you're really eating, and so unless there's, while we're pretending or trying to decide whether Seafood Watch has the answers or if Marine Certification has been mislabeling their food, instead of coming up with a worldwide traceability scheme, we're just trying to decide of which certification we trust more, when really the focus should be put back onto coming up with a better worldwide scheme.
And I would really like to point to the fact that I think it's terrible that Whole Foods and Safeway and McDonald's are now, quote, offering sustainable seafood. And I think those graphs are really a strong indication that, in fact, they are trying to meet the demand for this perception that we can feed the global economy with sustainable food. It's not.
and it's that pressure on the some of the bigger businesses to provide it that leads to a lot of incentivization of mislabeling the seafood.
And the real problem with the oceans is they're being overfished, and really what it's doing is just accelerating that process.
Own local catch to discuss the idea of sustainable seafood. I had so many questions. How does sustainable seafood go about competing in a market with mislabeling and subsidies? Especially in an industry where even those who receive subsidies tend to have a hard time making all their bills go away. Furthermore, in Monterey, a place with a long history of ocean exploitation, how do you go about changing such deeply rooted practices and traditions? The answer was simple: demand. Demand driven by a growing concern for the future of seafood and the health of our oceans. Now, in my discussion with Oren Fry, we discussed the stable, predictable demand for sustainable seafood in Monterey. He informed me that one of their biggest challenges so far has been coming up with enough supply to meet the growing demand. Just as we have heard, Walmart, Safeway, McDonald's have begun appealing to this growing demand for sustainable seafood, so has our local industry. Now, in order to be successful, they've had to work very hard to guarantee that their fish is sustainable. They've had to pay above market premiums. And furthermore, they only deal with seafood that is approved by our own local Seafood Watch. Furthermore, in order to create this transparency that seems to be lacking in the seafood industry, they have gone about creating a strong, flowing dialogue between the fishermen and their consumers. Now, local fishermen in Monterey are selling to clients who are Monterey Bay Aquarium employees, who up until now have been foes. So, we've got local supply, strong local demand. With these two factors, local catch Monterey Bay has seen a more than doubling of their business. Sustainable seafood is not only sustainable, it's right on our doorstep. Now, as we have seen, the tainted market, the mislabeling, makes seafood hard to judge. However, places like Maine lobster, places like Alaskan salmon, places like Iceland, their fishermen take the right amount of fish to allow for good catches for years and generations to come. Their fishermen apply to sustain their businesses as well as the health of the oceans. Furthermore, in aquaculture, today's incoming European fish farms are feeding their fish plant proteins instead of fish meal or chicken. Places like Villa La Palma, they don't even have to feed their fish because their system is completely self-supporting. So what we're saying is that the Marine Stewardship Council, Seafood, has given the ability for the local consumer to go to their local Whole Foods and decide for themselves which seafood to buy. Seafood Watch, MSC, there are a range. As long as that consumer is informed, they can eat sustainable seafood. Managed for the benefit of future generations, sustainable seafood is here and it's here to stay. In future years, we won't actually have to ask this question of whether sustainable seafood is truly sustainable, because it will be obvious.
I joined in 2006, and these are the percentage of fisheries that MSC has certified, 10% of the total global catch. And this is the amount that has what is considered low impact. So if you can see that, there's a little red sliver there, and those are considered low impact fisheries. Now Alexis is going to tell you a little more about MSC.
Okay, today we heard a lot about the Marine Stewardship Council. However, a lot was left out, and unfortunately, I'm here to tell you bad news. They are not all they appear. In fact, even though they represent or certify about 10% of the global fisheries, around 50% of the products they have are mislabeled. And just like we discussed, or you heard earlier when we talked about the Chilean sea bass, some of it they don't know where it comes from, and others of it they can't even verify that it is the species that they said it was. More than that, they have an open door system that allows for, there's a pretty low bar in fact, for entry into, to gain certification for the system, where even trawlers have been allowed. So how can you say that you support sustainable seafood if you allow the lowest of the low, the trawlers, into your party?
Okay, and we also wanted to talk about some of the demand side interventions that we've seen. Whole Foods did in fact pass the standard to only allow certified seafood, and we too found an article from the New York Times talking to fishermen who had a less positive outlook on it. And one of them said, "We are being murdered," but you know, that's a little dramatic. They talked to many fishermen who had sold up to 700,000 pounds of seafood to Whole Foods in the last year, and rather than saying they were caving to the demands and they were really upset about it or it was going to cost them this much, they just said who they were now selling to. They switched to legal seafood and other buyers who didn't have such strict standards. So this didn't really change the sustainability of the fishery itself, it just changed who they were selling to. And sadly, as we know, we live in a bubble here in Monterey of some very concerned, very wealthy people, and there is still lots of demand out there for cheap, unsustainable seafood that people are more than happy to
Pay less for.
Yes, to pay less for and to meet with bad alternatives. Okay, and also these ITQ systems and all this is set up on MSY, the maximum sustainable yield, which has been discredited by many biologists now. It was started in the 1930s, and it uses a very different baseline from the 1930s up until now. And it's a single species approach, and it assumes exponential growth, which since the decimation of our oceans, we just have not seen. And finally, we've heard some really great potential sustainability schemes for the future and things that are in the process now to become really great in the future. But we're here to discuss the present and the sustainable seafood that's available on the market today. Sadly, the solutions presented here are not plausible on a global scale, considering the significant upfront costs that they require and the ever-increasing profit potential from bycatch and illegal fishing. Without a sustainability scheme that addresses the entire ocean, a few fisheries will not be sustainable in the long term. In addition, those few fisheries that are approaching the standard of sustainable must fight to survive in a market hopelessly skewed in favor of unsustainable large-scale fisheries, making it economically impossible. So I'd like to close with a teaching from Buddha, who spoke of a man who was struck by a poisoned arrow. The doctor, of course, wanted to pull the arrow out, but the man insisted on first knowing who shot the arrow, where he was from, why the man shot him. Meanwhile, the poison was spreading through his body and killing him. So poisoned arrows have struck our oceans, and the poison is spreading throughout the body. So while we can debate whether this finger or that toe remains healthy, like the body, the ocean is an integrated system, and a few small parts cannot sustain themselves if the rest dies while we are arguing. So our oceans are dying, and until global action is taken to address the issues of traceability, climate change, perverse subsidies, overfishing, and other obstacles to sustainability, the poison will continue to spread. And questions and small-scale solutions, like we've heard today, are only distracting us from the reality of the situation. So unless the arrows are removed, seafood will never be sustainable and the oceans will die.